Now, we've just noted that the features of Leviticus that as we put it together with Exodus, and they are meant to be a matched pair, they go together. It all, from 19 on, happens at Mount Sinai. That while Exodus has given Israel the information in regards to whom and where to worship, Leviticus builds on that to trace out the how and the why. And so these taken together really give us the full exposition of what life for Israel was to be. Life in the land, life under the Lord. And so learn those those four sets of statements. And we noted that Leviticus is full of things like sacrifices and festivals, and we'll look in a very brief way at the festivals. Chief in Leviticus, probably with regard to the amount of space spent on it, are sacrifices, and that there were three functions of sacrifices. Atonement for sin, which has to do with the restoration of broken fellowship, whether it be eternally or day-to-day. Tribute offering, which has the idea of thanksgiving as well. And then just fellowship. And so they serve together and individually in these three areas. And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about what the sacrifices meant. Now, again, this I have always found in my study of the Bible from when I began to get into this material, and even in classes and so forth, to be just some of the most confusing in all of Scripture. And it's because we don't live in the world of blood sacrifice. We don't have all the information they had. This gives us, a lot of detail, and yet it leaves so much out as well. And yet there's, I think, we can make accurate statements about what it was all about. So we had noted the three functions, and now I want to look at the sacrifices. The first one, which is mentioned in chapter 1 and then also in chapter 6, and why it's repeated, let's just make that clear. In chapter 1, remember I mentioned that this is to all of the nation. Speak to the children of Israel. Say to them, when any one of you bring an offering to the Lord. And so this is for everyone to know what the offerings are to be and how it's going to be handled. And then in chapter 6, we repeat the offerings again. But you'll notice it's the law of the burnt offering. Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. So it introduces the sacrifices, the various things that are to be brought to the temple and done at the beginning in a general sense, which is all are to understand. And then it comes back around and talks more specifically about the responsibility of the priests, and gives them additional information. And so we find responsibility on both the populace as a whole and the priesthood with respect to how their life as a nation is to be carried on through sacrifice. And so this was a partnership. God put the priests there in order to aid people in coming to Him in whatever way they needed to. But it was the people who are responsible to come. And so we will find that there are sacrifices that are voluntary. They can be brought when a person is moved to do it. There are sacrifices that are obligatory. When certain things happen, then certain sacrifices have to be brought. And I'm going to talk about the clean and unclean probably on Friday. and fit this into this whole picture of the sacrificial system. Some observations. First of all, the description, whole burnt offering. Now, the burnt is not part of the Hebrew. It just is literally olah, and it's from the verb which means to lift up or to rise or to raise. And the idea is that it's obviously placed upon the fire, and the whole thing is consumed. And this is the offering that is not shared as a communal meal. So it is sacrificed in a certain way, but the olah is the rising offering. And so it is dubbed the whole burnt offering because that's what's happening. And the one word in Hebrew, and to them, signified that. And so there is not a word for burned, and it's not a word for whole, but it's the whole burnt offering in that it is, it ascends in the fire to God, and that's why it is called that. But the Hebrew is to the lifting up or the rising. That's what it means. So you've got the description, the meaning, rising up. It was the most important offering. This is the offering that Israel made twice a day, morning and evening. The priests would come, and this would be the first thing that would happen. They would offer one of these, and it would be for the nation as a whole. And then in the evening, they would close their day of service in the tabernacle, temple later, with the same offering. While you might think the sin offering is the most important offering, the sin offering does something different. This is the general offering of atonement. The procedure would be that the worshiper would bring the animal. If it were an individual bringing this offering, and individuals would bring this offering, or if the priest were offering it for the whole nation or for himself, he would bring the animal and lay his hands on the animal. And so that's always mentioned. And then slaughter the animal. And so we have an identification with the animal, and then a sacrifice of the animal's life. The priest would then take blood, would sprinkle the blood in the appropriate places and way, and then the offering would be burnt completely. The offering would be burnt completely. So that is the general procedure. And as I said, this was the daily offering that was given on the behalf of the nation. And it would be an offering that would accompany other kinds of sacrifice and other kinds of gift to God. And so this is the foundational, fundamental sacrifice in the Old Testament system. The meaning of it, indicated by the identification and the slaughtering, that the death of the animal is being substituted for the death of the sinner. The animal is dying in place of the sinner. And that's undoubtedly the rationale of the laying of hands on the animal. So you'd lay your hand on the animal's head, you're identifying with the animal and saying to the animal, in a sense, you're dying in my place. And so that really is the symbolism that we find here. And all peoples of the ancient world who offered sacrifices would have that kind of a thing. They were appeasing gods with the blood, and so there I think was that commonality of knowledge of other ancient religions. The animal must be perfect, and some of that had to do with cost. Atonement for sin is costly, and it also would look forward to the acceptance of the sacrifice by God, and look forward to the perfection of Jesus Christ that was necessitated. The interesting thing is that the type of animal was flexible. It depended upon the economic status of the person. And this, I think, is necessitated because it was the mandatory offering before anything else could happen. Before you could be cleansed from ceremonial defilement before you could offering a gift of thanksgiving, before you could make some kind of reparation for an offense. You had to offer one of these. And so it was something that every individual in the nation would, at least on occasion, have to offer. And so God, in His reasonableness, and He's demanding. I mean, He's holy. He demands perfection, but He's working in the real world and wanting people to relate to Him. And so there was variation, and that's the reason mostly why you will find the different kinds of animals accepted in certain situations. And so I think it had to do with economic status. And so that is the main offering. It's an offering that has to do with the penalty of sin, death through sin, and appeasing God's wrath against sin. And so this is the fundamental sacrifice that the nation of Israel would offer. And I think the one function of this offering is really to prevent God's displeasure at man's sin from being turned into punishment immediately. You see, every person that's born in the world is born into Adam's sin. At what point does a person deserve immediate extermination? At the point of birth. Why doesn't God do that? Why doesn't His holiness demand it? Well, His holiness does demand it. But God stays His hand, and the key thing in terms of what we would have to do with that is that He accepts, in the place of the death of the deserving sinner, He accepts the death of an animal. And that allows Him to, at least for a time, withhold eternal punishment. And I think that is the fundamental idea of this offering. And so it did not this was not an offering that put people into a right relationship with God. How does that happen? Remember Genesis 15:6? What's Genesis 15:6 say? Yeah. By faith. Abraham believed God, Yahweh, and He, is Yahweh, reckoned it to him, Abraham, as righteousness. Abraham was justified by his faith. Now, Abraham offered sacrifice. And that's one of the things that I think we often confuse, is that a person became a believer by coming and offering a sacrifice. And the Old Testament never indicates that. When did Israel become God's chosen nation? You'd say when they came out of Egypt, but they actually had been born before that as a people. And, there is sacrifice always there. But faith is what is the single requirement. Now, it's faith on the basis of the fact that sin is paid for, and sacrifice indicates that. But the act of sacrifice itself is not what's saved. It's faith in God's provision of the sacrifice. But this sacrifice would be repeated. And Christ's sacrifice is going to be once for all. But still, just hold faith as the key to entering into relationship with God. This sacrifice, this olah, if you want to look at it in relation to salvation, is that it stays God's hand of judgment, which is necessitated by His holiness. But He provides this offering as that which allows Him to not judge immediately with death. And so day by day, Israel recognized that it was God's gracious provision of blood atonement that they existed at all in His presence. So this is the fundamental offering, and every time some other kind of an offering is to be brought, this precedes it or accompanies it, because this just reflects that. And remember, these are object lessons. These are images. And so they're repeated over and over and over again just to reinforce the image. Though we're going to see, of course, in the New Testament that they are all finally realized and fulfilled in Christ. And yet we still carry the images continually. Now the next sacrifice is the minha. And this is just the Hebrew transliteration of the Hebrew words, or tribute offering. And we mentioned, of course, that God is the king. These were composed of grain. They were not a blood sacrifice. They were offered with the whole burnt offering, though. So you couldn't bring this offering unless it was accompanied by the olah, the whole burnt offering. It also was part of the daily ritual between God and the nation, the priests offering it on behalf of the nation. The meaning was just very simply, it was a gift or tribute. It was a gift to God, recognizing His worthiness, recognizing His goodness. It was a present in a modern sense. And in keeping with the whole king-vassal image that we have also in this, it was paid to a king by his grateful vassals. Kings demanded this of their subjects. In that case, probably more to kind of keep them cowering, to kind of keep them dependent, to kind of remind them that they owed him, and if they didn't behave themselves, he was going to smack them. Now that's not why God demanded this. I mean, this was all for Israel's benefit. But it was that by which they would say, we're appreciative. And so this has that kind of a meaning. The procedure was raw grain or baked bread, always with salt. Always with salt. And I think the salt is indicative of covenant. And you find salt associated with covenant. Salt is permanent. Now we can probably create fires today hot enough to change the organic structure of salt, but back then they couldn't. You can burn salt, it's still salt. You put salt into the ground and pour all kinds of water on it, and the salt's still there in the ground. So salt just has a permanence about it. And often, commentators and preachers will talk about its preservative value, and that may be, but that I think is somewhat more of a modern imposition back. Salt just is one of those elements that has a natural permanence to it. And so while food would probably be seasoned with salt, they don't use it like we do. Didn't, I don't think. In the extent, I salt everything. Salt things before I even taste them because they're never salty enough. Except I had a bowl of chicken noodle soup the other day that was almost too salty. But anyway. What? No, I don't know what it was. It was at a restaurant. So, but the idea of permanence. And so the fact that they were in a permanent relationship with God, a covenant relationship with God, I think, from my study, is why salt is included in so many offerings, and always with this one. The priest would mix it with oil and burn the sacrifice. He would keep most of it for himself. But this would be the offering. If somebody wanted to say thank you, they would bring this offering. And this would be the way God would be honored. And so this was voluntary, but it had to be accompanied by the olah, because you can only approach God through sacrifice, blood sacrifice. And so this is how it always worked. All right, the third offering was the shelamim, or the peace offering. Again, this was made with atonement and tribute offerings. And these first three offerings we're going to find are it falls into sets, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The meaning of it, well, peace or wholeness. Shalom is the root, or shalom, and shalom means peace, but it also means wholeness. It means well-being. It means happiness. It's kind of one of those general purpose words, those general utility words for wishing someone or expressing completeness or wholeness or peace or goodness. And so wholeness has got to be a part of it. And I think that'll fit in with what we're going to talk about on Friday a little bit in regard to the clean and the unclean. Shalom results from being in covenant with God. And so while somebody may wish somebody shalom, shalom aleichem, you hear in the movies and so forth, but yet it's God who brings this condition, who brings this. And so the peace offering was always in recognition of that. The procedure, I think you have in your notes, it was the worshiper would lay hands on and slaughter the animal like the olah. The priest would place blood and burn part of the animal, and this is the difference between the olah offering. The rest would be eaten by the priests and the worshipers. And here you see the aspect of the fellowship in the offerings. And so this is expressing, I think, the idea of the wholeness that comes through relationship with God. And the priests are representing God. The priests are standing on the earth for God. And so when the offerers would eat and share this meal with the priests, they would be fellowshipping with the priests on a horizontal level, but the priests acting for God would indicate that there is a vertical relationship here as well. And so it was a way of enacting the idea of giving it an image, giving it a symbol that indicated the relationship with God, and that wholeness of life is that which flows from relationship with God, and only from relationship with God in its most fundamental and complete sense. And so, we get that. Question?
Are all these sacrifices at the tabernacle?
These. Well, now that's a complicated question, and Scriptures sort of give two answers to that. For the nation, it would have always been at the central place. I think very likely once they got into the land, once the temple was built, that these sacrifices could have and would have been offered perhaps around the land. Because, I mean, obviously every time somebody wanted to give God thanksgiving, they have to run, 100 miles or 60 miles or whatever it is to the temple. And so there are some indications that there may have been, that this was, carried on in different places. Priesthood, the Levites would have been involved in that. But that's discussed in the literature, and it's not clear cut. There are certain things that had to go on in the tabernacle, later the temple, certain festivals that they had to come to there. So there could well have been that provision. Yeah, they can be slaughtered for food. If you found a dead animal in the somewhere out, depending on conditions, it could be used for food. The only thing I recall being said is, there's certain animals they couldn't eat because they're unclean, but you couldn't eat an animal with the blood in it. So in terms of how the animal was slaughtered, they would be required to slaughter it in such a way that the blood drained out, and then they could eat it. But no, they did not have to bring an animal to the temple in order to butcher it for, Sunday or Sabbath lunch, whatever. Yeah, Kyle? Why don't they? They don't have a temple. They don't have a temple. They don't have any place to do it. The sacrifices in terms of the ritual sacrifices for sin could only happen at the temple. Now I realize that impacts on the question of whether they could have places around, but it's something that happened in the land, and now they do kill chickens as a sacrificial sin-bearing type thing, but it's not the same. And it basically is they don't have a temple, they don't have a priesthood, they don't have a sacrificial system because they don't have the apparatus for it, as Moses instructed. And that's because they're under judgment. And there's theological reasons for that. But that places them in a conundrum. But that's part of God's discipline. Adam? Well, it exists from the beginning. And for all peoples, you see, with Abraham, God begins to deal with one family and creates a nation. And now he's dealing with the nation. And the nation, the nation is localized, and he regulates offering. But in the case of Job, in the case of Abraham, in the case of Melchizedek, in the case of Noah, the father was the priest of the family. And as the priest, he would offer sacrifices for himself and his family. I believe when Job offered sacrifices, he was doing the same thing. In fact, it's the word there, it's the whole law. He was offering an atonement for God's just general staying of punishment and so forth. So, all that we have, or what we have in the sacrificial system, is practiced in facets. So we don't have a complete understanding of it because we don't have that much information. But this is not new. It is simply being regulated and expanded for the nation for the purposes of God showing them and relating to them by the way of righteousness. Yes, yeah. Once the nation comes into being and he says, here's the place of sacrifice, then it became regulated, and the father was not the priest of his family. The tribe of Aaron was the priest for the whole nation and for every family. Yes, yeah. So that is a change, but it doesn't change the fundamental character of what Job was doing and Abraham and so forth. Now, it's the high priests who had to do certain things for the whole nation. But the Levites were also there as their assistants. And so I don't think it was 3 men servicing the whole nation in terms of individuals bringing sacrifice. Yeah, that's where you have the Levites who assist the priests. And the Levites become responsible and really acting in priestly fashion. And somehow it would have had to have worked like that. Now the other thing is, we just don't know if the nation, how diligently the nation applied themselves to this. I mean, we know by the, 100 or 1,000 years later, they weren't doing anything. So, the priests had a lot of time on their hands. They probably went trout fishing every other day, but, well, not trout fishing, but. Chris?
Did Levites sacrifice the Olah offering on the Sabbath?
No. No, the priests did it on the Sabbath. They broke the Sabbath. And that's the whole point Christ makes. They had to break the Sabbath. So, you guys are all messed up in your law. Yeah. Okay, so the peace offering, 2 types. Thanksgiving offering. If you wanted to say thank you, you just didn't say thank you, God. You brought him a present. Okay? So if you ever want to thank me for teaching you Old Testament survey, Nah, I don't want your presents. Huh? Yeah, bring me some corn. Bring me some wheat with salt in it. Plenty of salt. Yeah, and some oil too. Olive oil. Olive oil. Virgin olive oil. What is extra virgin olive oil? Yeah, I never figured it out. Anyway. So it was Thanksgiving. It was also used in the making of a vow. And you will find vows throughout. You get to Samson, you find the whole things of vows. Something that was very common then that we are, again, it's just one of those things that we're not familiar with. And so it just sounds so foreign. But these are the two types of the shalomim, or the peace offering, where the worshiper just wanted to express appreciation to God for who He was and what He had done. Or the worshiper was dedicating himself to something, and there are regulations for vows we find in other places in the Scriptures. So those were the two. Those are the first three offerings, and just the simple desire of the worshiper. And so we find this being the way that thanks can be expressed. And so it's exactly the same that we do today. We are told to offer spiritual sacrifices, aren't we? What are they? What are the spiritual sacrifices that you find in the New Testament? Amanda? Huh? Giving of thanks. What else in that passage? Okay, I don't know if that sacrifice isn't specifically used with that. Okay, Okay, your body as a living sacrifice is one, and then in Hebrews it says giving of thanks, praise His name, and material things. Slips my mind, but the same thing. We have a relationship with God. We want to offer Him thanks. We operate on the basis of the atonement for our sin and the final sacrifice of Christ. We come to God through Christ on the basis of His sacrifice. So that's all what's in image here for the nation of Israel. But again, it's all in picture. It's all in symbol. It's iconized. You know, the icons on your computer screen. You're all picture people. That's why I have so much trouble writing papers. Words. What are these? Let me draw pictures. Let me make sounds, and I'll communicate something. This very much was visual and smell-oriented and sound. And then no sound. Oh. Okay. So very sensual in the sense of sense-oriented. So you have this whole mechanism whereby people understand who God is, they're in His presence, how to come to Him, in the way that was the most powerful way of communication that was available. And so God is working in the situation in the ultimate way possible. And so just get that and be satisfied with the fact that we don't have all the little details answered for us. They knew what to do. They knew how to do it. They knew what it meant. And we're given sufficient information to know how it relates to the rest of God's revelation.